The orange sticker was already curling in the salt spray when Maeve Talbot found it slapped across the wheelhouse of her boat, and below it, in the gray dawn, 3 men from the Marina Association were trying to winch her vessel off its own pilings. "Stop the winch," she said, not loudly, and they didn't. So she walked out onto the dock she had rebuilt plank by plank with her own hands and set one boot flat on the cable where it ran taut over the first piling. "Those piles were driven in 1891. I can tell you the month and the man who set them. Can you tell me one single thing about this dock before you decided to drag my boat off it?" The winch operator throttled down and looked back at Bruce Halloran, who stood at the head of the float in a Navy Club blazer with brass buttons, a clipboard held against his chest like a breastplate, wearing the unbothered calm of a man who has never once been told no by water, or by anyone foolish enough to be standing on it. "Miss Talbot." He still did not look up. "The harbor is a shared community amenity. Slip permits only. It's in the welcome packet every owner signs. That's a $250 mooring violation, and it compounds at $50 a day. I'd move the boat before it becomes the association's boat to move." 6 months before the winch, there had been no sticker, no blazer on her dock, no men at dawn. There had only been the fog and the tide, and the kind of quiet Maeve had crossed most of a country to find. She had come north to Cedar Hook to be left alone with the water. She was 57, 4 months retired from a 31-year career as a tidal oceanographer with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. 3 decades of building tide tables, running bathymetric survey, and arguing in conference rooms about precisely where the legal line between land and sea actually fell. Because the sea, unlike a deed, refuses to hold still while men draw on it. She had inherited the old keeper's house at the mouth of the harbor from a great-aunt she had met exactly twice, and she had spent her first half-year there doing 3 things: rebuilding the rotted dock board by board, logging the tides every morning out of a habit 4 decades deep, and learning which herons stood on which piling at which stage of the water. The basin below the house had filled in over the years with a marina community of very expensive boats and a clubhouse that flew its own pennant, and Maeve had paid all of it precisely no attention, because a person who reads water for a living learns early that the loud things on the surface are almost never the things that decide anything. The morning the sticker appeared, she photographed it before she peeled a corner: the citation, the pilings, the waterline against the tarred wood, the time, the stage of the tide. Habit, and more than habit. A tidal scientist records the datum before anything else, because without the datum, every measurement that follows is just a confident guess wearing a number. She went up to the clubhouse that afternoon to settle the thing the way a reasonable adult settles things, and asked Bruce Halloran the one question the whole matter turned on. What gave the association title to the harbor bottom and the right to charge a living soul to tie a line to it? He slid a laminated marina map across the bar, slips gridded in confident blue, the whole basin stamped in bold capitals, "Common Waterfront." "It's all common, Miss Talbot. Always has been, since before you got here. Pay the permit like every other owner, and we won't have a problem." "There's no datum on this," Maeve said, turning the sheet under the window light the way she'd turn a chart she suspected. "No survey line, no Tideland grant number, no bearing, no benchmark." Somebody drew a grid of slips on top of a pretty picture of the water and laminated it. She set it back, squared to him. "Here's the thing your map doesn't know. Water cannot be owned. The right to navigate it belongs to the public and always will. But the ground underneath the water can be owned, by deed, like any other dirt. Those are 2 completely different questions, and your laminated picture has answered neither one." The county deputy who rolled out before sundown was young and visibly wished himself anywhere else on the peninsula. He looked at the clubhouse, the gridded float, the orange sticker, and spread his hands. There was a marina. There were fees. People had paid them for years. That made it civil. Take it to court. Maeve had heard that exact sentence enough times across her federal career to recognize it for what it was: the noise a system makes when the truth of a thing has no box on its form. So that night, she finally went up into the keeper's house attic and untied the canvas roll she had noticed her first week and left alone, the way you leave a gift for a day with room in it. Her hands went still the moment it opened. United States Coast and Geodetic Survey topographic sheets, the original T-sheets, hand-inked in the 1890s when the survey of this coast was young, every cove and spit and piling rendered in a draftsman's patient line. And beneath the brittle sheets, bound in salt-stiffened leather, a logbook, the Harbor Lightkeeper's Journal, its entries running back further than the county had kept good records at all. The T-sheets set the line of mean high water, and the tideland grant that ran with it, squarely down her own title, the harbor bottom, the wharf pilings, the right to moor a hull against them. The association's cheerful blue grid had been painted directly across private submerged land that had belonged to the keeper's house since before the survey finished naming the rocks. The association's reply to her written questions was not a reply. It was a daily penalty. Then, a lien threat against the keeper's house, designed to tilt the floor under a woman who had thought the place was finally hers. Then, a declaration taped to her own rebuilt dock, pronouncing it structurally unsafe and demanding it be surrendered to community management for the safety of all. A man in an unmarked windbreaker arrived 2 days later, photographed her pilings end to end without a word, clipped something to a contractor's estimate board, and was gone before she could cross the float to ask his name. She photographed his truck. No marina logo, no county seal, nothing at all, which was itself a kind of answer she filed away. Sadie Cross found her at slack water 3 days later. 75, lean and upright, with a stare like a gaff hook, and the unhurried voice of someone who had outlived most reasons to rush. "My father drove a good half of those piles," she said, with no preamble, because the fact had waited long enough. "And every boat that ever tied up here paid the keeper for the privilege, not some yacht broker who blew in 10 years back and printed himself the title of commodore." She nodded at the leather book. "It's all written down in there. They say you read tides for the government. So read who built this harbor with their hands before you let a blazer take it off you." Maeve laid the 1890s T-sheets over the modern county chart and pulled the title datum the way she had 10,000 times for the federal government, correcting for the rise in sea level across 130 years, sliding the old mean high water line into register with the new until the two agreed within a foot of certainty. The numbers fell into a lock she had been turning her whole career. Then Theo Nguyen came out, a young volunteer hydrographer who physically could not leave a disputed boundary alone, and ran a side-scan sonar sweep of the basin, and brought the image back to her dock dripping and grinning, and it made Sadie put down her tea. The drowned pilings on the bottom matched the 1890 survey rank on rank, exactly where the T-sheets swore the keeper's wharf had stood for 13 decades, and nowhere near where the association's grid pretended the common bottom began. Past and present lay down on each other like two prints of one photograph. Ramona Vieira, a Seattle attorney who chased submerged land and admiralty cases the way other people chase crosswords too elegant to abandon, read the grant, the T-sheets, and the sonar in one sitting and folded her hands. "Let's be precise, because precision is the entire game," she said. "You cannot own the water. The public right of navigation is ancient, federal, and untouchable, and we are going to say so ourselves, first and loudest, before anyone can paint you as the woman who tried to fence the sea. But the bedlands, the ground, the pilings sunk into it, the right to moor a hull against land you hold in fee simple. That is yours, under a tideland grant older than the state's filing system, and this association has built an entire harbor for the use of it for 6 straight years. She uncapped her pen. Quiet title on the bottom in the wharf, a counterclaim on every fee as unjust enrichment. And we state on the record, in writing, that the navigation channel stays open to every vessel afloat, because the moment we overreach is the moment we hand them the win. Discovery opened the basin to the daylight. The subpoena duces tecum went to the association and to Sound Harbor Group, a developer whose name nobody at the clubhouse ever quite said aloud, and dragged the real plan up off the bottom. Sound Harbor had been quietly preparing to expand the marina and sell the slips as condominium shares, and it had known for years that the harbor bottom carried a fatal tidal defect. The whole basin sat on the keeper's private tidelands. Their fix had not been to clear it honestly. Their fix had been to paper it over with a common waterfront map and keep Bruce Halloran collecting, because Halloran, the subpoenaed books showed, had been skimming guest slip cash past the association's ledger for years, and Sound Harbor held that grubby little secret over him the way a cleat holds a straining line. And the man in the unmarked windbreaker had a name after all. The same subpoena pulled his invoice, not a county inspector, not an engineer, but a demolition contractor on Sound Harbor's own payroll, sent to write the structurally unsafe finding to order, so the developer could condemn the keeper's historic wharf, tear it out, and drive new commercial piling for the expansion before anyone thought to survey whose bottom it stood on. He was the rope strung between the blazer and the developer, and once Ramona had his invoice, the two ends pulled into a single knot. Then, Maeve opened the keeper's logbook to its earliest pages, and the case stopped being about a boat. The first keeper to drive these piles and light this lamp in the careful copper plate of 1891 had signed his name at the foot of every entry. Talbot, her own great-grandfather. The wharf she had been rebuilding board by board for 6 months with sore hands and a borrowed nail gun. The pilings she was now fighting 3 men and a developer to keep. The light standing dark at the harbor mouth. Her own blood had built every plank and beam of it, and the deed had simply lain folded in an attic for 130 years, waiting with the patience of tide for a Talbot to come back up the coast and read it. She sat a long while with the lamp and the water rising in the dark outside, and understood that she had not inherited a house with a view. She had come home to a post that someone wearing her own name had stood at, in fog and gale, for 13 decades. Sound Harbor did not retreat an inch. It countersued, claiming a century of open public use had ripened the whole basin into a prescriptive common, owned by no one and used by all. And it went to work on Sadie Cross where she lived. A noise complaint against her little house. An inspector measuring her porch steps against a code not enforced on that road in 40 years. The court declined to freeze the slip fees on the papers alone. Money, the judge noted dryly, can always be refunded. But it barred the community management seizure of the wharf pending a hearing, and set that hearing for the 1 week of the season that Maeve, alone in the room, knew how to read in advance. A king tide was forecast, the highest water of the year. That was the part the surface men had not bothered to read, because reading water was beneath them and beyond them both. Maeve had read it weeks out. The king tide would load the old pilings Halloran's people had refused to maintain for a decade, and the marina's own neglected guest float, overloaded, jammed gunwale to gunwale, its cleats soft with rot, sat squarely in the path of the surge. She filed the warning in writing, dated and specific, the way she had filed 10,000 tide predictions for the government. They ignored it, the way they ignored everything, because it came from her. The king tide came in on the eve of the hearing like the sea remembering something it was owed. Maeve was already out on her dock at 4 in the morning with Theo and Sadie, lashing down the historic pilings she could reach, when the association's overloaded guest float gave a long, shuddering groan, took the surge full broadside, and tore 3 rotten cleats clean out of the deck in a spray of splinters. In the dark, boats began to swing loose and drift. $100,000 of somebody's unmanned cabin cruiser, untethered, swinging bow first straight toward the marked ferry lane where the first run was due inside the hour. Maeve did not call the deputy. She had learned what the deputy was and was not for. She raised the Coast Guard on Channel 16, gave them the tide stage, the set of the current, and her best drift bearing. And then she did the thing 31 years of reading moving water had driven into the marrow of her hands. She took her own boat off its pilings, ran it out between the drifting hulls and the open channel, and made fast to her great-grandfather's pilings, the strong ones, the ones a Talbot had built to stand exactly this, and held the whole runaway raft of the association's neglect against the full weight of the king tide, while the current fought her for it. Theo worked the lines beside her, hand over raw hand. Sadie ran the radio like she'd been born holding it, and Bruce Halloran stood up on his lit clubhouse deck in his blazer and watched the woman he had tried to winch off her own dock at dawn save his entire marina with that same dock, and the pilings under it he had spent 6 months swearing were not hers. The hearing, after a night like that, was almost a formality, but Ramona ran it like one that mattered. She took the prescriptive common claim apart in clean strokes. Public navigation across these waters had always been permissive and was never once in dispute, but permissive passage over the surface can never, under any doctrine, ripen into private ownership of the ground beneath it, the precise and only thing the developer needed it to do. Then Maeve laid the bottom of the harbor before the court, the way a navigator walks a board of inquiry back through a grounding. Datum first, because everything stands on the datum. Then the 1890s T-sheets registered over the modern chart. Then Theo's fresh sonar dropped over both. 3 independent lines closing on one another, decade over century, within a foot. The keeper's wharf, the pilings, the Tideland grant. Every part of it ran with her title, and the bold, common waterfront was revealed for what it was, a confident watercolor laid over 130 years of private ground. Sadie named the men who drove the piles. The contractor's own invoice, read aloud, tied the unsafe condemnation to Sound Harbor's payroll. The logbook, in a dead keeper's hand, named the family that had held the light since the survey itself was young. The court quieted title to the bedlands, the wharf, and the mooring rights squarely in Maeve's favor, voided 6 years of slip fees as unjust enrichment and ordered them refunded, and stated, in the deliberate language Maeve had insisted be read into the record, that the public right of navigation through the channel remained open to every vessel afloat, now and after. The skimmed cash and the concealed title defect went to the county prosecutor as a package, and Sound Harbor's docominium scheme, marketed to buyers across state lines on a harbor bottom it had never owned and known it didn't, went up to the federal prosecutor as wire fraud. The federal case did not stay an abstraction for long. The competitor's acquisition team that had been circling the expansion read the same title defect in the open court record and walked, and the docominium prospectus that had already gone out to buyers in 3 states became, overnight, a stack of mailed promises about ground the sender did not own, which is the whole of what wire fraud is. Sound Harbor's principal was arraigned that winter, and Maeve drove down to sit in the gallery, because she wanted to be in the room when a man who had drawn a grid over her family's harbor heard it read back to him as a crime. Bruce Halloran lost the Commodore's blazer and the association ledger he had been cooking for years. But because the developer had held his own skimming over his head like a breath he was never allowed to let out, the prosecutor let him plead to a single count that kept him out of a cell. Maeve did not push for an inch more. She had spent a career telling the true waterline from the one men wished into their maps. And she knew, better than almost anyone alive, the difference between the tide itself and the fool who builds his float below it and blames the moon when it floods. She could have closed the harbor off and let the club drown in its gridded slips, and not one soul on the peninsula could have said a word against her right to do it. Instead, she did the exact opposite of the thing they had spent 6 months frightening the residents about. She offered every resident honest, cheap, written moorage on the wharf her own family had built, recorded a document guaranteeing the navigation channel open for good so no Commodore could fence it again, and turned the club back into what it had been before the blazers came, a working harbor. The lighthouse at the mouth, the lamp her great-grandfather first lit, she placed under joint stewardship with the Coast Guard and the County Historical Society, and the light came back on for the first time in 30 dark years. Theo won a grant to map the whole sound to modern standard and complained happily that it would take him years. Ramona picked up 3 more submerged land cases off the ruling. Sadie Cross was made official keeper of the very light her father had tended, an appointment she accepted by observing that it was about time somebody got around to asking. And Bruce Halloran made the only restitution a man like him had in him to make. He left the association's true old moorage ledger, the honest one, on Maeve's dock one gray morning without a word or a note, so she would know exactly who across the years had actually paid and who had not, and he never spoke of it again, which from Halloran was as near to an apology as the tide ever comes to standing still. On the evening they relit the light, the ferry sounded its horn far out in the channel, long and low and patient, the way it had all through her first foggy season in the keeper's house. Maeve did not bolt a plaque to the dock or carve a motto into anything. She climbed the stairs to the keeper's desk, opened the leather logbook her great-grandfather had begun in 1891, turned past 130 years of entries written in her own family's hand, and at the bottom of all of it, she added a new line in her own. Tide log, entry 1. The water is open to all. The ground beneath it is ours. Light relit at last, high water. M. Talbot, keeper. Here's what I keep circling back to. Bruce Halloran spent 6 months certain he owned that harbor, and he was wrong about it in the most literal way a person can be wrong. He didn't even know which part of it could be owned at all. That's the quiet trap under this whole story. Water and the ground beneath it look like one thing when you're standing on a dock in a blazer. They are not. You can't own the water. The right to navigate it is public, ancient, federal, untouchable. But the dirt under it? That's a deed like any other. Halloran never learned the difference, and a developer made a fortune-shaped bet that nobody else would either. What I love is that Maeve's whole power came from refusing to argue about the surface. Everyone else was fighting about permits and fees and who flew the pennant. She went straight down to the datum, the boring, unglamorous baseline that every honest measurement stands on, and pulled an 1890s survey into register with a modern one until the truth lined up to the foot. The blazer had a laminated picture of the water. She had the ground beneath it. Those were never the same fight, and only one of them was real. And notice, she could have become exactly what they accused her of. She held title to the harbor bottom. She could have fenced the sea and watched the club drown. Instead, she put the channel's openness in writing herself, because the day you overreach is the day you lose, and she'd spent a career knowing precisely where the line falls. The deepest cut in the whole thing is that her own great-grandfather built those pilings, and the proof of it had been waiting in an attic for 130 years for a Talbot to come back and read it. So here's the real question, and it's not about boats. How much of what you think you own is actually yours on paper? And how much of it is just a laminated picture somebody handed you and told you to believe? Most of us never check. She did. And the tide, as always, kept its own honest records.